Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we got a special weekend edition of Evangelical Dark Web because Joe Carter has dropped a steaming turd on the Gospel Coalition. I call him BuzzFeed Joe Carter because he usually writes BuzzFeed level articles and FAQ type articles and stuff like that. But the one time he doesn't, it seems, it is this article right here, which ultimately compares uh, and argues that Ruth and Naomi were a civil union. So we're going to dive into this load of cringe from the Gospel Coalition, which is not really a coalition founded on the gospel, as we've seen from its founders, Tim Keller and D.A. Carson. But nonetheless, it continues. It is a top 5,000 website, give or take, in the United States, which is huge. There are not many religious websites that are not strictly Bible apps that are bigger than the Gospel Coalition. So, a lot of people read this article. A lot of people might have been negatively influenced by this article. And that's why we go after the Gospel Coalition. They are huge. They are huge. That's why we do that. So, anyway, simple solution to same-sex civil unions, same-sex civil marriage. And this is Joe Carter's December 1st article, 2022, obviously. And we just could not wait until Monday to do this video. So we're going to do it Saturday, Friday night, really, and tackle it. So Joe Carter begins. David French recently sparked a lively debate by addressing marriage in Why I Changed My Mind on Law about Law and Marriage. French, a conservative evangelical. Hold up, he's neither of those two things. Maybe evangelical, but his theology is pretty much more in line with Episcopalians at this point, explains his flip-flop and flip back again on civil marriage, emphasis in original. So he italicized civil in the original article, but and then French goes on to say, I emphasize the word civil because my view on the religious nature of marriage has not changed, says French. It is a lifelong covenant between man and woman, sealed before God and breakable only on the limited conditions God has outlined in his word. Not surprisingly, French's article has received a considerable backlash. Dozens of articles, blog posts, and Twitter threads have been pushed back against his change of heart. While some of the responses are motivated by a personal dislike of French, some have said he's not even a Christian. Right here, he's not a Christian. David French is not a Christian. He just isn't. I think the general reaction is due to a broader frustration with evangelicals who share his viewpoint, and that group is growing larger every day. I'm not sure, basically he's trying to say that evangelicals are caving on this issue of marriage, which who knows how true that is, but that doesn't change how biblical or unbiblical the point is. The tide on public opinion is unlikely to be turned by publishing another article pointing out why French and the other 40% of churchgoers are wrong. Still, there's a solution to the problem that is easily implementable, and that should be acceptable to almost every Christian and most secular Americans, yet no one's talking about it. So, to Joe Carter's credit, before he goes full cringe, he does refute French's argument, basically by explaining what marriage is. Like, marriage predates government, and marriage predates the church. It predates an ecclesiastical governance because it proceeds, or not, it proceeds from, first the creation of man and woman, then the institution of marriage. Or at the same time, the institution of marriage happened with the creation of man and woman. So that's when marriage was created. Marriage belongs to the institution of the family. It does not belong to the institution of the church. It does not belong to the institution of the state. Marriage is to be recognized by both. And David French's argument is incredibly weak because non-Christians have legitimate marriages. non-Christians have legitimate marriages. Marriage is not inherently only a religious institution. Now, the purpose of marriage has highly spiritual implications and highly spiritual realities. But as far as meeting a definition goes, two non-believers can have a legitimate marriage. And I guess David French is trying to like Jesus juke the issue by saying, you know, my marriage is still religious, but, you know, it doesn't matter if the civil government has a different standard or definition of marriage, because the religion I say I believe in, but really don't, because David French is not a believer, is that they can call it marriage or whatever, but it's not a real marriage. So he wants to gatekeep on marriage by adding theological tests, and that's not biblical, because non-Christians can have a marriage according to the Bible, because marriage was given to man. It was given to the institution of the family, not to the institution of the church, not to the institution of the state. It predates both those things. And that's a point that Joe Carter, to his credit, does at least try to make here. So we're going to skip ahead. Actually, I do want to talk about this. In this way, the relationship is similar to nation states. The United States government, for example, can decide to recognize the state of Israel, but it cannot redefine the country in a way that contracts or expands its borders. The United States either recognizes Israel as it defines itself, or it rejects its legitimacy altogether. You know what's funny about that example? And this isn't an anti-Zionist point, but the United States did not recognize the borders of Israel until Trump was in office. Trump decided to recognize the Golan Heights as Israel. The United States did not recognize Israel as Israel recognized itself for several years. This is a point that goes over Joe Carter's head because he doesn't know history, apparently. Specifically, the history of Israel and its 1967 borders and the Six-Day War and how they took all this land. And the United States only recognized the land gains of Israel in recent years. And I'm not even sure they recognized all of the land gains. For instance, you know, Russia has annexed Crimea, and for Ukrainian states, again, this is a bad example for that reason. The United States does not recognize Russian Crimea, even though Russian Crimea is a reality. So that point doesn't stand very well. So I'll move on to the next section, because this is the heart of the cringe. This is where it's like, what in this nonsense is Joe Carter saying? It's about the third act of the article, so to speak. So Ruth's solution to the problem. What do we do about homosexual couples who have ordered their lives around the legal fiction of same-sex marriage? French says, I wanted gay couples to enjoy marriage-equivalent legal protections, but without changing the legal definition of marriage. That was always a possibility and still is. We don't need to attempt to redefine reality and call a tail a leg to achieve this objective. The solution is, and always has been, to promote civil unions. And this is such crap, because it was never about marriage. It was never about marriage. The homosexual movement is not a monogamous movement. You know, the whole Dave Rubin thing, he's an exception to the general pattern that is the movie Bros is a much more accurate depiction of mainstream homosexuality than what these people are talking about. It was never about the issue of marriage. It was always about the issue of affirmation. It's always about the issue of affirmation. Bros is a much more accurate depiction of homosexuality in the United States. That's why that movie bombed. But it is what it is. So, bad argument off the bat. The problem with civil unions and the reason they weren't more broadly endorsed by conservative Christians is that they were previously promoted as endorsing homosexual couplings, but they excluded relationships more worthy of legal recognition. Now, the libertarian argument of getting the government out of marriage does not hold water because there are the government needs to recognize marriage. You got the issue of inheritance. You have to look at the fact that the United States government, in its welfare state, you can't get rid of the institution of marriage as recognized by the government, but not get rid of the welfare state first, because our entire welfare state is based on FPL levels, household FPL levels. I work in IT, so I know and the project that I'm working on is all about these types of programs and FPL levels for a household as federal poverty line, for those who aren't familiar. But that has to do with your household. So the federal government revolves and its services revolve around this concept. So you can't put the cart before the horse, first of all. Second of all, marriage needs to be recognized for inheritance, for spousal rights in court, and a bunch of other issues that are so small you don't really think about them. But the government needs to recognize marriage. You can't just say the government can't recognize any marriage. That's stupid. So the problem with civil unions, and the reason they weren't more broadly, is that they were seen as endorsing homosexuality. And to some degree they were, because that was a compromised position from the previous sodomy laws that the United States had. That's a compromised position from the biblical ideal. Fact. Of course, that wasn't going to be embraced by Christians. It was a biblically compromised position. Rather than using them to provide legitimacy to homosexual relationships, civil unions should be completely desexualized and open up to any two adults, why only two, as we'll get into in a second, who desire to enter a type of contractual relationship known as a mutual beneficiary contract. Our model for civil unions comes from the most unlikely source, the book of Ruth. And again, he compares, the one time, again, Joe Carter doesn't write a BuzzFeed level article. It's to say that Ruth and Naomi were in a civil union. And this is nuts. In that narrative, Ruth displays an amazing dedication to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Recently widowed and trying to survive during a time of famine, Ruth chooses to stay with Naomi even though it meant she would almost assuredly live the rest of her life in poverty and eventually die alone. Such love and compassion is so remarkable that many modern readers assume the relationship must have been sexual. That seems like a straw man. I don't know how many people who assume that, but I guess that's out there. I mean, crazier interpretations have been made. It's a sad commentary on our times that all final relationships, or filial relationships, are assumed to have an underlying sexual motivation. But what if Ruth and Naomi lived in modern day America? Would they be able to keep this commitment to each other without hindrance from laws that recognize only dependents, guardians, and spouses, including same-sex spouses? The law may very well provide them with equal protection under the certain circumstances, but with the labyrinth of rules and regulations, how will they know what applied? Because of the Obergefell decision, the United States gives special preference to homosexual couples who have a marriage license, yet denies or complicates similar legal arrangements for family relationships similar to Ruth and Naomi. Any young gay man may enter into a civil union with an older man in order to confer benefits on their sexual behavior, but a nephew couldn't enter into a similar contract with his disabled uncle in a way that would simplify his ability to provide care. And this is his closer. It's a bit long, but this is his closing stretch. Old idea worth recovering. This solution isn't a new idea, nor is it a radical change. When a form of desexualized civil unions known as reciprocal benefactory contracts was considered in Colorado in 2006, Carrie Gordon Errol, director of issues analysis for Focus on the Family, argued that the bill would simply streamline arrangements that are already allowed under Colorado law. So, and she has a quote there. I won't read that. At the time, Earl and Focus on the Family were criticized by many of their fellow conservative Christians because it was feared the legislation would help normalize homosexual partnerships. This was a legitimate concern 16 years ago when many gay rights activists begrudgingly considered civil unions a necessary waypoint on the path to full recognition of same-sex marriage, but subsequent Supreme Court decisions, starting with the decision to overturn the Defense of Marriage Act, made such a transition period unnecessary. Desexualizing civil unions would alleviate the concerns of people like French who want to allow gay couples in civil marriages to enjoy the benefits they currently receive. It would also solve other problems he addresses. I want gay couples to enjoy the legally protected right to build a life together without creating a legal superstructure that ripped apart religious freedoms that are indefensible to the health of the republic and the flourishing of countless millions of American lives. Desexualized civil unions wouldn't be a threat to religious liberty in the same way that same-sex marriages are and will indefinitely continue to be. But even more importantly, it would preserve the government's purpose of recognizing arrangements that bring stability to our society without endorsing immoral sexual behavior. And this is where he goes off the rails. And Joe Carter's not living in the reality here. If you open up the door to civil, whatever he's talking about, what's to say it should only be 2 people? Why not 3? Why not 4? Why can't 4 people have this mutual benefactory arrangement that Joe Carter's arranging here? Since there is no standard of commitment, there is no standard of intimacy. It is entirely subjective, and it is entirely to rig the system in your favor. It is entirely so you can get legal governmental benefits. What's to stop more people from getting in on this? And then furthermore, what is to stop that arrangement of more people getting in on it from transferring also into marriage? Because, obviously the issue of polygamy has been a big deal in the United States. The idea that one man can have multiple husbands, which, again, I think is allowable in God's law, especially under certain circumstances, but is not considered ideal and quickly goes astray of God's law, quickly gets you afoul of God's law, or puts you in situations that are not good. Not good. But, David's not condemned for having multiple wives. Solomon is more condemned for letting his wives influence his faith than having multiple wives. And then, obviously, Jacob, Leah and Rachel, Bilhah, and I forget what the other one's name. But those aren't condemned relationships. As a relationship, those aren't condemned. But they're not ideal either. So the point that I'm making is a double standard. If one woman has multiple husbands, that's a relationship that makes no sense biblically. That would never be allowed. That's not a permissible arrangement. But you're seeing instances like that on the internet. Usually it's one guy and multiple women because the woman says she's bisexual or whatever. But what we did see, and this was a couple years ago, was the one ugly chick that had 4 dudes, 4 incel dudes, and she got pregnant from one of them, and then the tragic story after that was that one of the other dudes beat the baby because what's the greatest threat to a male or a child as far as domestic or even sexual abuse is like non-biological male in the house. Number one threat. So the point that I'm making is that Joe Carter's exceedingly short-sighted, exceedingly eisegeted solution to a problem that he's seeing in today's world will quickly be the waypoint for a different form of immorality, because there's no reason that this system that he's listing should only stay at 2 people. There's no reason for that. Where are we at? As a society, we should question why we're extending social and governmental benefits to a group based on sexual behavior while excluding other non-sexual unions that are more worthy. And he's trying to do a values assessment. But here's the thing. Marriage is the highest relationship. We've already perverted that definition. Now you're trying to create other categories. This is the Revoice movement. This is what the Revoice movement is trying to do. Let's treat friendship as a replacement substitute for marriage. That's not biblical. Marriage is one sphere of government on earth. Another sphere is the church, and another sphere is the state. You can't create your own, or the family, marriage and the family, really. And then you got the self, because you got to have self-control as well. But marriage is not something to be counterfeited with civil unions. And the way that he would counterfeit this would lead to all sorts of other immorality issues. So he's trying to say that Ruth and Naomi is a much more worthy relationship. Let me just read his last 2 paragraphs and we'll close out this video. Government doesn't create the institution of marriage. It only recognizes its value. It has no legitimate authority to redefine the term to make it more inclusive of sexual and numerous numerical variations. Marriage should be reserved for the intimate, exclusive, sexually complementary relationship of one husband and one wife. I agree, it should be that way. Similarly, the government also doesn't create relationships in which 2 adults agree to take care of one another, but when stripped away of any sexual connotation and reserved for 2 persons, again, by what standard would you reserve it for 2 people? Dependent commitment sharing relationship, the state should recognize their value and make it easier, not harder, for modern day roots. Again, what necessitated how do you keep that to only 2 people if friendship is ultimately the standard here? You just can't. Joe Carter's not intelligent here. He just isn't. He's a midwit here. He's trying to think that he's smarter than he actually is, but he actually is sounding dumber than he actually reads. He's actually the dumbest guy in the conversation. Because, yes, he disagrees with David French, because David French is wrong on just about every issue, even the Amazon's Lord of the Rings of Power, he's wrong on that as well. But this is the worst midwit response I've ever seen to a David French point. So, anyway, if you like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel if you are new. Also, drop a like button. This is the Evangelical Dark Web. We have a free newsletter that has articles on Saturdays, because I don't usually do videos on weekends, but exceptions had to be made. And if you really like Evangelical Dark Web, we got a Patreon-like system you can support it, and that's linked in the video below. Have a blessed day. We will catch you on the next one.